Thanksgiving should have smelled of comfort and safety, roasted turkey with herbs, pies cooling on the counter, cinnamon candles flickering in the corners, but that night the air felt thick with smoke and dread. The chandelier above the dining table glowed too bright, the kind of light that makes every flaw visible, every wrinkle sharper. Crystal glasses chimed as relatives laughed at jokes I could not follow. Knives scraped against porcelain plates with a steady screech, and in the middle of it all, I sat at the long oak table pretending to belong. Mark sat at the head, his shoulders squared like a king, surveying subjects, his wine swirling dark red like blood in the glass. I had barely opened my mouth to answer a harmless question from his cousin when he pushed back his chair. The screech of wood against tile made my stomach clench. He stood, eyes flashing with something sharp, and before I could draw breath, his palm cracked across my face. The sound exploded through the room like a gunshot. My head whipped to the side, a burst of heat searing my cheek, the taste of iron flooding my mouth. A fork clattered to the floor. A child gasped. Someone stifled a laugh. For one frozen second, even the chandelier seemed to sway. I pressed my lips together to keep from crying out. My skin pulsed where he had struck me. My ears rang. My vision blurred at the edges. And then came the voices. Margaret, my mother-in-law, leaning back with her glass of sherry, murmured that maybe I should learn to watch my tone. My brother-in-law chuckled that women needed discipline. A cousin smirked and looked away as though the scene was entertainment, not violence. Laughter bubbled again, filling the silence like acid poured on an open wound. I sat rigid, my heart slamming so hard against my ribs it hurt shame crawling up my neck like fire. I wanted the floor to open and swallow me whole. Mark slid back into his seat with a smirk, lifting his glass to the room, as if he had just delivered a toast, as if humiliating me was the main course. He smirked wider when no one stopped him. They never did. Under the table, I felt Chloe's hand find mine. Small, warm, trembling. She squeezed once, twice harder each time the others laughed. I did not dare look at her at first. I did not want her to see me broken, my cheek burning red, my spirit bending under the weight of all those eyes. But when I finally turned, her gaze was locked on her father. Not frightened, not pitiful, fierce. 10 years old and already carrying storms in her chest. Her jaw clenched, her eyes sharp with something that made Mark falter, just for half a second, his smirk flickering before returning. She leaned closer, so quiet only I could hear, and whispered, "Mom, one day he will regret this." My breath caught. Around us, the family raised glasses again, forcing cheer into the air, the smell of gravy and wine swirling into something nauseating. My face throbbed, my heart ached, but in that single whisper I heard a promise. The promise that what began at that table under the glare of chandeliers and the sound of forced laughter would not end the way Mark imagined. He believed he had silenced me. He had not noticed the fire in the eyes of his daughter. The sting on my cheek did not fade when the laughter returned. It grew hotter, throbbing in rhythm with my heartbeat, a constant reminder that I had been struck like a disobedient child in front of everyone I had spent years trying to please. The chandelier's glow turned cruel, every crystal prism scattering light that made my humiliation sharper. I tried to steady my breathing, but each inhale tasted of bitterness of gravy, heavy with garlic of wine, sour on my tongue. I wanted to run, but my legs felt nailed to the floor. Margaret's voice cut through the noise sharp and casual, suggesting that I had provoked him, that wives should not embarrass their husbands during family gatherings. She dabbed her lips with a napkin as though she had not just justified violence. A cousin leaned toward another, whispering behind a hand, both of them smirking. The scrape of knives against plates resumed harsh and grating like a soundtrack to my shame. My head pulsed and I could feel every eye that dared to glance at me before sliding quickly away, complicit in their silence. Mark chewed slowly, deliberately, as though nothing unusual had happened. He carved another slice of turkey, placed it on his plate, and poured himself more wine. He leaned back in his chair. His expression satisfied his smirk, daring me to contradict him, to rise and scream knowing I would not. My daughter's hand remained in mine beneath the tablecloth. She squeezed harder now, so hard, her fingernails dug into my palm. I looked down at her small wrist, the faint shadow of a bruise from last week, still visible, one of those accidents we never spoke of aloud. My throat tightened. She was not only witnessing my pain, she was carrying her own. I forced myself to sit upright to hold my glass, though it trembled in my hand. If I spilled, they would laugh again. I could not give them that. Every muscle in my face fought to keep the tears from falling. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, anything to keep my expression neutral. Inside, my mind screamed. This was my family now. I thought the people who had embraced me when I married Mark, the ones who toasted our union years ago. And yet in this moment, they looked at me not as a daughter or a sister, but as a nuisance, a woman who deserved to be kept in line. I wanted to shout that they were cowards, that their silence was worse than his strike, but my voice caught in my chest, strangled by fear. Chloe shifted slightly in her chair, her shoulders squared in a way I had never noticed before. She looked around the table, her gaze sweeping across uncles, aunts, cousins, her jaw tight. They avoided her eyes as much as they avoided mine. She did not release my hand, she anchored me with it. For the first time, I realized she was not just holding on to me, she was holding me in place, keeping me from collapsing entirely. Mark raised his glass, then, his voice thick with wine, thanking everyone for coming, wishing blessings for the year ahead. His words dripped with hypocrisy, every sentence a dagger, and they clinked glasses in return, a chorus of loyalty. My stomach twisted. The room smelled of butter and sage and smoke, but to me it reeked of betrayal. My pulse hammered against my throat, the heat of the room suffocating. I felt invisible, yet exposed, like prey surrounded by predators who toyed with me for amusement. I looked at Chloe again. Her eyes were steady, dark, unblinking. She whispered without moving her lips so low I barely caught it. "Mom, I am not afraid." The words sliced through my despair, leaving a scar of hope. I swallowed hard, turned back to my plate, forced myself to breathe. The meal went on as if nothing had happened, conversations shifting to football games and Black Friday sales. But under the table in the secret world where only Chloe and I existed, her grip and her whisper were the only truths that mattered. And in that silence I understood that though I had been silenced tonight, the story was not finished. When I think back to the beginning, I wonder how I ever believed in the fairy tale. Mark was charming when we first met, the kind of man who made a room tilt toward him. He worked in finance, then crisp suits, polished shoes, a smile that could melt suspicion. I was 27, working long shifts at the hospital, proud of my independence, but lonely. He noticed me in the grocery store, asked if I needed help reaching something from the top shelf, and I laughed, letting him hand me a box of cereal I could have reached myself. That laugh turned into dinner, then weekends away, and within a year, a diamond ring glistened on my finger. Everyone told me how lucky I was. For a while, I believed it. He was attentive at first, generous, always pulling out chairs, opening doors, sending flowers after a late shift. But cracks formed quickly, hairline fractures that spread like veins of ice across a frozen pond. He questioned the hours I worked, asked why I could not cut back, suggested I was neglecting him. I thought it was love disguised as jealousy. When I came home exhausted, he would say my makeup was smudged, that I looked careless, that I should put in more effort. I told myself it was honesty. The first time he raised his voice so loud the neighbors knocked on the wall, I apologized to him for provoking him. The first time he shoved me against the counter, leaving a bruise along my hip, he cried, afterward, swore it would never happen again, and I clung to that promise like a drowning woman to driftwood. But driftwood cannot save you from the current. The apologies faded, the violence escalated each incident, followed by days of icy silence instead of regret. When Chloe was born, I thought he would soften. For a while, he did, holding her in his arms with tears in his eyes, promising he would be a better man. But the nights grew long, money grew tight, and the weight of responsibility seemed to sharpen his cruelty. He controlled every dollar, demanded receipts for groceries, scolded me for buying a small toy for our daughter without asking. He told me no court would ever give me custody if I tried to leave, that judges favored fathers with stable jobs, that I would be left with nothing. I believed him because he said it with such confidence. and his family backed every word. Margaret told me to stop being dramatic when I once whispered that I was afraid of him. She said men get angry, that it was my role to calm him to keep him satisfied. When I showed her the bruises, she shook her head and said makeup could cover anything, that marriages survived worse. Every relative had a phrase ready, a line of defense for Mark, a way to fold the blame back onto me. It was easier to carry their silence than to fight all of them at once. So I stayed. Nights turned into years. Chloe grew her eyes sharper than I wanted them to be. She learned to read the air in a room before she entered, to know from the angle of her father's shoulders or the pitch of his voice whether it was safe to speak. She never played too loud, never laughed too long when he was home. She hugged me tightly when he stormed out, whispered she would take care of me someday, and I would force a smile telling her she was only a child, though. Secretly, I leaned on her strength more than she should have carried. There were moments I almost left. I packed a bag, once tucked it in the trunk, drove halfway across town with Chloe asleep in the back seat. But the thought of custody battles, of Mark's threats, of facing his entire family in court with no one on my side sent me driving back before dawn. He found the bag the next morning, and the slap that followed reminded me how trapped I was. I told myself to endure, that children needed both parents, that perhaps one day he would tire of cruelty and settle into something calmer. But hope became chains, and every link tightened with time. The holidays were the worst, the gatherings where his family filled every corner of the house, eyes watching, ears listening, always ready to excuse him, always eager to remind me I was lucky to have him. They told stories of his childhood brilliance, his scholarships, his business deals, ignoring the fact that he was already slipping, that his temper burned through opportunities like dry leaves. They looked at me as if I were a servant expected to smile, to refill glasses, to laugh at jokes made at my expense. I became invisible except when he needed a target, and then every eye sharpened, every silence condoned what he did. Chloe saw it all, too much. She kept notebooks hidden under her bed, scribbling things she overheard, dates, times, words. I discovered them once, my heart breaking at her small handwriting, describing how Daddy yelled, how Mommy cried, how no one helped. She was documenting our lives before I even realized she understood the weight of it, and though it pained me, a part of me knew those notebooks were seeds of something I did not yet dare name. As the years passed, I aged faster than my reflection, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow, a woman fading in the mirror. Mark's smirk grew stronger, his confidence built on the fortress of silence his family provided. He believed himself untouchable. And in some ways he was, because every time I thought about fighting back, I saw the circle of relatives, the judges he swore would side with him, the lawyers I could not afford. I stayed because fear had wrapped itself around me like barbed wire. Yet through that fog there was always Chloe, watching, recording, growing. Her presence reminded me daily that even if my voice was silenced, hers was forming, shaping into something sharper. She was the witness he could not erase. And deep down, I began to wonder if one day her truth would be the key that shattered his illusion of control. I did not know when Chloe began keeping records beyond the scribbled notebooks I once found. She was quiet about it, secretive in a way that both frightened and impressed me. At first, I noticed her lingering with the iPad longer than usual, her fingers moving quickly when Mark's voice rose the screen angle just enough to capture his rage without him noticing. I thought she was playing games, clinging to distraction, but the truth revealed itself one evening when I walked past her room and heard the sound of my own voice crying from the device. My stomach dropped. I opened the door, and she sat frozen, eyes wide, clutching the tablet. I reached for it, but she pulled it against her chest and shook her head. "Mom," she whispered, "you need to hear this." The video played, and there it was, undeniable, the image of Mark standing in the kitchen, veins bulging in his neck, shouting that I was worthless, punctuating the words with a shove that sent me into the counter. My body recoiled even as I watched it, shame flooding my veins, but Chloe's eyes were steady. "You say nobody believes you," she said. "Now they have to." I wanted to tell her she should not carry this burden, that children were meant for laughter. Not evidence, but the words stuck in my throat because I knew she was right. She had done what I had not dared. I sat beside her on the bed, my hands shaking, and she showed me file after file, moments I had tried to bury, each one labeled with dates and times. She had stored them on a cloud account under a password only she knew. My chest ached with a mixture of pride and sorrow. I had spent years trying to protect her from the ugliness of our home, but she had been protecting me instead. Days later, I received a call from her teacher, Ms. Harris, asking if we could meet after school. She was a woman with gentle eyes, a firmness in her tone that suggested she had seen more than most wanted to admit. She closed the classroom door behind us and pulled out her laptop. "Chloe showed me these," she said softly. The screen glowed with videos. I recognized files I had not given. My breath caught. I should have been angry that Chloe had shared them without telling me, but instead, I felt a strange relief, as though the truth had finally seeped out through cracks I could not seal. Ms. Harris explained she was legally required to inform Child Protective Services. My first instinct was panic. Mark would find out. His family would twist it. We would suffer worse. But Ms. Harris touched my arm, steady grounding. "Linda," she said, "you and Chloe deserve to be safe." She outlined steps, resources, numbers I could call. She spoke with certainty, not pity, and I clung to that certainty. For the first time, someone outside our poisoned circle had seen the truth, and they had not looked away. Chloe sat beside me, her chin lifted, her shoulders squared. She was no longer a child in that moment, but a witness, an advocate. Later that night, after Mark passed out on the couch with an empty bottle, I sat with Chloe at the kitchen table. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. The clock ticked steady, and she pushed a slip of paper toward me. It was a list of the files she had saved, with backup copies hidden on a USB stick taped behind the dresser. I stared at her handwriting, neat and careful, and tears blurred the ink. "You should be drawing flowers," I whispered. She reached for my hand. "I cannot let him win," she said. Her voice did not tremble. My chest swelled with both grief and admiration. She was 10 years old and already carrying the weight of survival strategies I had only begun to consider. I wanted to promise her it would end soon, that we would walk out and never look back, but fear still clamped around my ribs. Mark's threats echoed in my head, the way he said no judge would side with me, the way his family's silence confirmed his power. Still, the evidence was there now, alive in files and in the eyes of an ally who believed us. Ms. Harris kept in contact, checking in quietly, careful not to draw attention. CPS began asking questions, small ripples in the surface of Mark's controlled world. I lived in terror he would find out, but also in a fragile hope that maybe finally the truth had teeth. Nights grew long. I found myself listening for the faint click of Chloe's iPad, the whispered notes she made. Each sound was a dagger of guilt and a shield of protection. She was building a case without even knowing the word for it, and though it broke me to see her innocence replaced with vigilance, I also knew she was right. The truth once gathered could not be erased. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she looked at me and said, "Mom, when the time comes, we will not be alone." I did not ask how she knew. I simply believed her. The weeks between Chloe's quiet recordings and the next Thanksgiving blurred into a haze of dread. Every day I woke, waiting for Mark to discover what she had done, terrified he would rip the iPad from her hands, search her drawers, and find the hidden USB taped behind her dresser. Every slammed door made me flinch. Every raised voice made my heart pound, but Chloe carried herself with a calmness that unsettled me. She seemed to know something I did not. One evening, she slipped into the kitchen where I was folding laundry and pressed her phone into my palm. A message glowed on the screen. It was addressed to my father, Colonel James Walker. My breath caught. My father had been a Marine for 30 years, a man of iron posture and unshakable principles. He had never approved of Mark, though he rarely said it aloud, preferring silence over arguments that tore families apart. But now there it was, a string of messages from Chloe to him, each one containing links to files, video after video, evidence of what she and I had endured. I nearly dropped the phone. My knees weakened. Chloe looked at me steadily. "He needs to know, Mom," she whispered. "He will protect us." I wanted to scold her for going behind my back, but the truth rose in my throat like a tide I could not fight. She was right. My father called the next day. His voice was low, steady, a current of anger beneath the calm. "Linda," he said, "I have seen enough. You and Chloe will not face this alone. I tried to tell him not to interfere, that it would make things worse, but he cut me off with the authority of a man who had commanded battalions. I will not stand by while my granddaughter becomes a witness to this. His words wrapped around me both terrifying and comforting. For years I had been alone, gaslit into silence, but now a force larger than fear had entered the battlefield. The days crept toward Thanksgiving with a suffocating tension. Mark grew more arrogant, perhaps sensing my unease. He bragged at work parties, raised his voice more often, his hand striking the table with casual menace whenever I hesitated. Margaret called me twice to remind me about the dishes I was expected to bring, her tone laced with disdain, as though I were the hired help. Chloe and I exchanged glances behind closed doors, silent codes of reassurance. She whispered at night, "Grandpa has a plan." I wanted details, but she would not say, only squeezed my hand in the dark until I drifted into uneasy sleep. On the morning of Thanksgiving, the sky was the color of steel, heavy with clouds, a storm pressing at the horizon. I dressed carefully, choosing a blouse high enough to cover fading bruises. Chloe brushed her hair with deliberate care, her face set with a seriousness far beyond her 10 years. We drove in silence to Mark's mother's house, the weight of inevitability pressing on both of us. The house glowed warm from the outside, golden windows wreath on the door, smoke rising from the chimney. Inside, it reeked of butter and sage and pretense. Relatives filled the rooms with chatter laughter that rang hollow in my ears. Mark thrived in that environment, slapping backs, shaking hands, his voice booming with false charm. He kept a glass of wine in hand, refilling before it emptied, his smirk fixed like armor. Every so often, his eyes flicked to me, a reminder of his control, daring me to falter. Margaret hovered near him, whispering in his ear, both of them glancing at me with expressions that cut deeper than words. Dinner was served in the dining room, the same long oak table polished until it gleamed beneath the chandelier. I sat near the middle, Chloe beside me, her small hands folded in her lap. My heart pounded as if I were already running. Plates clattered, voices rose, glasses clinked. On the surface it was a holiday, but underneath it was a stage set for something else. I noticed my father's absence until halfway through the meal. Then the front door opened and the sound of heavy boots crossed the hallway. Conversation faltered. Colonel James Walker stepped into the room, his presence commanding, his posture rigid in a dark suit that carried the same authority as his uniform. His gaze swept the table, pausing on me, then on Chloe, then hardening as it settled on Mark. The room shifted. Mark laughed loudly, too loudly, rising to greet him, feigning warmth. Colonel did not return the smile. He placed a leather folder on the sideboard, the gesture deliberate, final. I swallowed hard. I knew what was inside. Chloe's eyes lit for the first time that evening, a flicker of fire she could barely contain. Mark poured more wine, his laugh strained, insisting the Colonel join us. But there was a tremor in his voice, the first crack in his confidence. My father sat, his silence heavier than any speech. The conversation around the table stumbled, restarted, then faltered again, as though everyone sensed an unspoken storm building. I felt it in my chest, a pressure mounting, squeezing the air from the room. Chloe leaned closer, her lips barely moving. "Tonight," she whispered, "the truth comes out." My skin prickled, my palms damp against the fabric of my skirt. Mark raised his glass again, launching into a speech about family, about loyalty, about respect, every word twisted by the smirk curling his mouth. His eyes cut toward me with every sentence, each one another slap. The relatives nodded, clinking glasses, swallowing the lies like wine. My father's eyes never left him. The room grew hotter, the chandelier's glow harsher, the scrape of silverware unbearable. My pulse hammered. I gripped Chloe's hand under the table. She was calm, steady, her gaze fixed on her father with an intensity that seemed to pierce him. I realized then that the confrontation was not coming later, not weeks or months away, but tonight in this very room under this very light. And for the first time I believed we might actually win. The moment hung, suspended the air thick with anticipation, the chandelier trembling slightly as if the house itself braced for what was to come. Colonel James Walker reached for the leather folder resting on the sideboard. The simple act silenced the room more effectively than any shouted command. He opened it with deliberate care, sliding out a thin laptop and a stack of printed pages. The shuffle of paper seemed deafening against the hush. Mark laughed nervously, his voice cracking, asking what this was all about, pretending nonchalance, while his knuckles whitened around the stem of his glass. The colonel met his eyes without blinking, then pressed a key. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly the room filled with the echo of a voice everyone recognized. Mark's voice, raw and furious, bellowed from the speakers. "Worthless, useless, you are nothing!" The image followed, grainy but clear enough, showing Mark shoving me against the counter, my cry sharp, the thud undeniable. Gasps rippled through the table. A fork clattered to the floor. Margaret's face, drained of color, her lips parting soundlessly. Cousins stared wide-eyed, shifting uncomfortably. Mark surged to his feet, shouting that this was taken out of context, that it was doctored, that it was nothing. But the colonel's finger pressed another key, and the next clip rolled. Chloe's small voice begged him to stop, followed by his sneer, his hand raised. The slap cracked through the speakers and echoed in the stunned silence of the dining room. I felt the burn on my skin all over again, but beside me, Chloe sat tall, her eyes locked on her father, unflinching. The videos continued, each one a nail hammered into the coffin of his lies. His denials grew louder, frantic, his words tumbling over each other, but the images spoke louder than his protests. He tried to lunge toward the laptop, but the colonel's hand was there first, firm, immovable, the quiet authority of decades in command radiating from his stance. "Sit down," he said, his voice low and resonant, more forceful than any shout. Mark froze, chest heaving, face flushed red, then purple. He looked around the table for support, but the eyes that had once looked away now refused to meet his. Margaret stammered that it could not be true that her son was a good man, but her voice trembled, cracking under the weight of what she had just seen. Chloe stood then, her chair scraping against the wood, the sound sharp as a blade. She turned to face the entire table, her small frame illuminated by the harsh chandelier light. "My dad hurts my mom," she said, clear and unwavering. "He hurts me too. You all knew. You laughed when she cried, but now you cannot say you did not see." Her words cut deeper than any video, the purity of her voice undeniable. Mark reached for her, a twisted mix of anger and desperation, but I was on my feet before I realized it, blocking his path. "Do not touch her," I said, my voice stronger than I had ever heard it. My knees shook, but I held my ground. The colonel stepped forward, placing a protective arm in front of Chloe and me, his gaze never leaving Mark. "Enough," he commanded. "I have already spoken to the authorities. They are on their way." The words detonated in the room. Mark's face contorted, spittle flying as he shouted betrayal, conspiracy lies. He turned to his family, begging, demanding their defense, but no one moved. Margaret wept quietly, her napkin pressed to her face. An uncle muttered a prayer. A cousin pushed his chair back and slipped from the room, unable to bear the scene. Then the sound of sirens cut through the night, faint at first, growing louder, closer. Mark's eyes widened, darting to the window where red and blue lights flashed against the dark. He bolted toward the back door, but two officers appeared in the hallway, their voices firm, commanding him to stop. He fought, shouting, his arms thrashing, but they were stronger trained, and within moments his wrists were bound in steel. The silence that followed was broken only by Margaret's sobs and the heavy breathing of everyone who had witnessed the collapse of a man they once defended. Chloe reached for my hand again, her palm warm, her grip fierce. Her voice carried through the stunned quiet. "You always told us to be loyal," she said, her eyes on her grandmother. "But loyalty to lies is not loyalty at all." The words landed like a verdict. No one argued. The officers read Mark his rights, their voices calm and steady, pulling him toward the door. He shouted threats, promises of revenge, curses that rang hollow now that his power was stripped away. The colonel closed the folder, slid the laptop back inside, and stood tall, his presence filling the room. "It is finished," he said. The room exhaled as one. I felt my shoulders sag, the weight of years lifting, though fear still flickered the memory of what he had done etched in my skin. But Chloe stood beside me, unbroken, her gaze fierce. For the first time in a decade, I believed the nightmare might truly end. The night after Mark was arrested, silence filled the house like a heavy fog. Chloe slept pressed against me, her small body finally at rest, while I stared at the ceiling, heart still racing. The flashing lights, the clink of handcuffs, the final look on his face, they replayed again and again until dawn. But when morning came, a knock at the door brought something I had never held before: an emergency protective order. The officer explained it in firm, patient tones. Mark was barred from coming near us, barred from contacting us, barred from setting foot in our home. The paper felt heavier than its weight, as if it carried years of prayers folded into one thin sheet. For the first time, I allowed myself to breathe. The following weeks were a blur of court dates and statements, each step surreal. We sat in small waiting rooms, my father at my side, Chloe clutching her notebook of dates and times. Lawyers spoke in clipped tones, judges asked precise questions, officers shuffled through stacks of paper. Each time I opened my mouth to speak the truth, my voice shook, but the evidence steadied me. The videos, the audio, the bruises documented in hospital reports, they spoke louder than fear. Chloe was called once, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with each word. She told the court what she had seen, what she had heard, how she had hidden her iPad under her blanket to record the truth. There was no malice in her tone, only clarity, the unshakable honesty of a child who had carried too much but refused to lie. I wept silently as she spoke, both broken and proud. Mark sat across the courtroom, shackled, his jaw, tight eyes blazing. He muttered to his lawyer, shook his head violently, but the recordings played on screens for everyone to see. His smirk vanished as his own cruelty echoed back at him. Margaret testified too, though her words faltered. She tried to defend him, tried to paint him as stressed, misunderstood, but under cross-examination, her defenses collapsed. Each video stripped away her excuses until she sat in silence, staring at her folded hands. The trial stretched for days, each one draining, but momentum built like a tide. Prosecutors outlined patterns of abuse, psychologists testified about trauma, social workers confirmed the risk. Mark's lawyer argued desperation, claimed alcohol, claimed depression, but no excuse could erase the violence immortalized on screen. When the verdict came, the room was hushed, every breath held. Guilty, the judge intoned on multiple counts of domestic violence, child endangerment, and assault. The words fell like stones into water, sending ripples through every corner of the courtroom. Mark's shoulders sagged, his hands clenched, but there was no fight left in him. The sentence followed swiftly: 10 years in state prison, mandatory counseling, no contact permitted with me or Chloe. The gavel struck, and it was done. Relief swept through me, but so did exhaustion, as though my body had waited years to finally collapse. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, the story already spreading. I shielded Chloe from the noise, guiding her to the waiting car, where my father stood, his arm steady around us both. The headlines would tell their own version, but I knew the truth. It was Chloe's courage, her recordings, her refusal to stay silent, that had brought justice crashing down on him. In the days that followed, we returned to a quieter house. The locks were changed, security cameras installed, neighbors alerted. CPS closed their case with the note that Chloe was safe now, though the social worker left me with resources numbers to call groups to join. Nights were still restless, haunted by echoes, but the nightmares no longer ended with his smirk unchallenged. Instead, they ended with the slam of a gavel, the clang of a cell door. Chloe smiled more, though the shadows lingered. She played piano again, her fingers tentative on the keys, music returning to the rooms like sunlight after a storm. I sat beside her listening, letting each note stitch me back together. My father visited often, his presence both fortress and reminder. He told me, justice is not revenge, it is restoration, and though scars would remain, we had won something no one could take away: safety. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. Trauma does not dissolve with a verdict, but with every step, every breath in a house free of shouting, I felt pieces of myself returning. And when Chloe laughed, truly laughed for the first time in years, I knew that despite everything, we were finally free. After the sentencing, the silence from Mark's family was almost louder than their laughter had once been. For years, they had dismissed my tears, rolled their eyes at my bruises, called me dramatic, weak, or ungrateful. Now they avoided my calls entirely, though I had stopped dialing after the first unanswered attempt. Weeks later, Margaret appeared unannounced at our door, her face drawn, her hands clutching a tin of cookies, as though sugar could sweeten years of complicity. Chloe stiffened at the sight of her grandmother. I stood in the doorway, the chain still latched my body, blocking the entrance. Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears. I did not know, she whispered, her voice trembling. I did not know it was that bad, but the videos had shown her. She had heard my cries echo through the speakers, seen the fear on her granddaughter's face. She had known and chosen silence. Chloe spoke before I could. "You laughed, Grandma. I remember." Her words sliced the air, steady and sharp. Margaret flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I just wanted to keep the family together," she pleaded, but the excuses fell flat, brittle as ash. I told her gently but firmly that Chloe and I needed space that we could not heal in the shadow of denial. I closed the door softly but firmly, the click final. Word spread quickly among extended relatives. Some sent letters dripping with apology, promising they had not understood, that they regretted not intervening. Others muttered that I had exaggerated, that Mark was under stress, that I had ruined his life with vindictiveness. I stopped reading after the first handful, realizing their words were not meant for me, but for their own consciences. My father stood guard, fielding phone calls, deflecting visits. He reminded me that blood does not guarantee loyalty, that silence is a choice, and that Chloe and I had the right to choose peace over poisonous ties. Chloe adjusted faster than I did. She no longer looked for approval at family gatherings, no longer flinched at her father's name. She poured her energy into school, into piano, into drawing. One afternoon, she sketched a picture of the Thanksgiving table, every detail captured with startling precision, except one change in her version. The chandelier above blazed like sunlight, and everyone else's faces blurred into shadow. Only hers and mine were clear. I framed it and hung it above her desk, a reminder that we were no longer invisible. Holidays came and went, quieter but freer. Thanksgiving passed with just my father, Chloe, and me at a small table set with simple dishes. The silence was comfortable, filled with genuine warmth instead of forced laughter. At Christmas, we baked cookies, the kitchen filled with cinnamon and joy rather than tension and fear. The absence of Mark's family was not a void, but a relief. Still, sometimes memories returned unbidden. I would recall the way cousins had looked away, as Mark shouted, the way Margaret had scolded me for ruining dinner when I could barely stand. Anger flared, then subsided into resolve. I would not let those moments define us anymore. Letters continued to arrive sporadically, invitations scribbled with pleas for reconciliation. I placed them in a box I never opened again. Chloe once asked if we would ever see them. My answer was steady. Not until they understand silence is not love. She nodded, wise beyond her years, and returned to her drawings. The fallout extended beyond family, too. Neighbors whispered, co-workers tilted their heads with pity or curiosity. Some praised me for my courage, others avoided me as though my pain were contagious. I learned to let their judgments roll off, focusing instead on the circle that mattered: Chloe, my father, and the few friends who had stood by me quietly all along. Through it all, I discovered a truth I had resisted for years. Family is not defined by who shares your blood, but by who shares your burden. The ones who sat silent as I bled were no family to me. The ones who stood, who acted, who believed, that was family. Chloe understood this instinctively. She no longer asked why Grandma did not visit, why cousins did not call. She had seen the truth clearer than I had. She had heard their silence, felt their absence, and decided she wanted no part of it. Watching her resilience, I found my own. The fallout was messy, painful, and at times lonely, but it cleared space for something new, something stronger. For the first time in years, the word home felt real again. Spring arrived slowly, as though the world itself hesitated to believe the winter was truly gone. The trees outside our small house budded cautiously pale green, unfurling under gray skies. Chloe and I planted a garden together, our hands deep in the soil, laughter mingling with bird song. Each sprout that pushed through the earth felt like a victory, a quiet testament that life continued even after storms. I returned to work part-time at the clinic, tentative at first, but the familiar rhythm of caring for others steadied me. Patients came and went, their stories weaving into mine, reminding me that healing was not only possible but necessary. Chloe flourished at school, her teachers praising her resilience, her friends drawn to the strength she carried. She played piano in the evenings, music filling the rooms with warmth instead of dread. My father visited often, his presence still commanding yet softened with pride. He told Chloe stories of discipline, of courage, of standing tall even when fear threatened to crush you. She listened intently, absorbing every word, her eyes reflecting the fire he had carried all his life. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future not built on survival, but on possibility. The past still lingered scars, both visible and hidden, but they no longer defined us. Nights were easier now, sleep coming without the weight of dread. Dreams sometimes brought shadows of Mark's voice, but they faded quickly in the light of morning. Letters from Mark's family dwindled, then stopped altogether. I did not chase them. Their absence was not a wound, but a space for peace to grow. Chloe never asked again why we did not visit them. She knew, as I did, that silence can be louder than words, and that some doors once closed should remain shut. One evening, she brought me a drawing she had made. It was of us standing in a field of sunflowers, our faces turned toward the sun, her small hand in mine, my father standing behind us like a sentinel. At the bottom, she had written in careful script, "Family is who stands with you." I framed it and hung it in the living room where anyone who entered could see. It was not just art, it was truth etched in the ink of her young wisdom. Looking back, I realized that justice had not come in a single moment, but in a series of choices. Chloe choosing to record, my father choosing to act, me choosing finally to stand. Each decision was a stone laid on the path that led us here. The courtroom verdict had been loud, but the quiet victories, the laughter over cookies, the peace of an unbroken night's sleep, the freedom to open the door without fear were just as powerful. To those who hear this story, especially those who sit in silence fearing no one will believe them, I say this: your voice matters. Even if it trembles, even if it whispers, it carries weight. Evidence allies truth. These are your weapons against cruelty. And to the older hearts listening, those who may wonder if it is too late to break free, I promise it is not. I was trapped for years, convinced escape was impossible, until a child reminded me that courage is not measured by age, but by resolve. Justice is never easy, but it is always worth fighting for. Chloe grew taller that year, her laugh brighter, her steps lighter. She no longer looked over her shoulder, no longer shrank from sudden sounds. I watched her run through the garden sunlight on her face and knew that though scars remained, they did not own her. They marked her as a survivor, not a victim. As for me, I carry lessons carved deep. Family is not the blood that binds, but the hands that lift you when you fall. Silence is not love. Love is the voice that says, "I believe you." And justice, though slow, arrives when truth is laid bare. In the quiet of our rebuilt life, I found something unexpected: dignity. It had been stripped from me piece by piece, but with each step forward, each boundary held, it returned stronger than before. And with dignity came peace, a peace I vowed never to surrender again. If you've stayed with me until the very end of this story, thank you. I know it was not easy to listen to the pain, the betrayal, and the long road to justice, but I also know many of you out there, especially those of us over 50, have carried silent burdens of your own, whether from family, from broken marriages, or from people who should have loved you but chose cruelty instead. What this story shows us is simple but powerful: silence only serves the abuser. Speaking up, gathering evidence, leaning on allies, and protecting our children is what breaks the cycle. Justice may move slowly, but it does arrive, and it arrives stronger when truth is undeniable. So let me ask you, where are you watching from tonight? Are you in a small town, a busy city, maybe listening alone in your kitchen or with family in the living room? Tell me in the comments below. I read every story you share, and together we form a community where no one has to suffer in silence. If this story moved you, please give it a like, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who might need the reminder that courage has no age. Family is who stands by you, and here you are, never alone.